I should have let him die, that's the truth I keep telling myself every time I hear a train in the distance, because that night didn't feel like the beginning of something, it felt like the end of a life. I understood the end of quiet nights, and small paychecks and problems that could be solved with overtime shifts at Mercy General. It was 11:42 p.m. when Emma and I took the shortcut along the tracks, the cold air cutting through my thin jacket, the kind of November chill that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it is. My daughter's small hand wrapped around mine, warm and trusting, as she skipped over cracks in the pavement, humming a tune from a cartoon. She loved something soft, something safe, nothing like what we were about to walk into. I remember thinking about rent, about how I was $312 short, and how I could maybe pick up another double shift if I begged my supervisor enough. I remember thinking about normal things, real things, not the sound that came next, a low metallic groan carried on the wind, followed by something sharper, a vibration under my feet, subtle at first, then growing stronger, like the earth itself was warning me to turn around. We should have turned around, any reasonable person would have, but Emma stopped suddenly, her fingers tightening around mine. "Mom, do you hear that?" she whispered, and then she pointed not at the tracks, but beyond them to where the dim security lights barely reached. That's when I saw him at first, just a shape wrong in a place where nothing should be wrong. Then details came into focus, a man lying across the tracks, his body angled awkwardly, like he had been placed there, not fallen. My breath caught, my mind scrambling to make sense of something that didn't fit into any version of reality. I understood. "Stay here," I said automatically, but Emma didn't let go. "Mom, he's going to get hurt." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that's when I heard it clearly, the distant horn of an approaching train, long, low, unmistakable. About a mile out, maybe less. Not enough time, not nearly enough time. I should have called 911. I should have pulled my daughter away and waited for someone else, someone trained, someone stronger, but there was no one else, just us and a man who wasn't moving. The world narrowed to seconds, to distance, to the pounding of my own heartbeat. "We're helping him," Emma said before I could decide, and somehow that decided it for me. We ran, gravel crunching under our shoes, the cold biting at my lungs as I dropped to my knees beside him, up close. He didn't look like someone who belonged here. His clothes were too clean, too precise. Even in the dim light, I could see the cut of his coat, the way it fit, like it had been made for him, not bought off a rack. His wrists were bound, not crudely, but carefully secured in a way that told me this wasn't random, this was intentional. My fingers fumbled at the restraints, panic making everything clumsy, useless. Come on," I whispered, more to myself than to him, the vibration under us growing stronger, the horn louder, now closer, too close. Emma hovered near his shoulder, her small hands trembling, but steady enough to brush against his sleeve. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, softly, like she was afraid to scare him awake. That's when his eyes opened, and everything inside me went still. Not relief, not fear, something else, something harder to name. His gaze locked onto mine, sharp, clear, aware in a way that didn't match the situation. He didn't look confused, he didn't look desperate. He looked like he was assessing me, measuring something invisible between us. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, controlled, as if the approaching train wasn't seconds away, as if he had all the time in the world. I almost laughed at that, the absurdity of it, but my hands kept working, pulling at the last binding until it finally gave way. "Neither should you," I shot back, breathless, as I grabbed his arm. "We have to move now." For a split second, he didn't move, he just kept looking at me, and I felt it again, that strange reversal, like I wasn't the one saving him, like I had just stepped into something I didn't understand. Then the ground shook harder, the light of the train cutting through the darkness, and whatever hesitation, he had vanished. He moved fast, faster than I expected, his weight shifting as we dragged him off the tracks, the three of us stumbling into the gravel just as the train roared past, a rush of wind and noise that stole the air from my lungs. I pressed Emma against me instinctively, my heart slamming against my ribs as metal thundered inches away, too close, far too close. When it was over, silence fell, heavy and disorienting, broken only by my uneven breathing and the fading sound of the train disappearing into the night. I let go of him slowly, my hands still shaking, as I checked Emma first. She was fine, wide-eyed, but unharmed, thank God. Then I looked back at the man we had just pulled from death, and he was already sitting up, already composed in a way that didn't make sense for someone who had just been seconds from disaster. His attention wasn't on himself, it was on me again, always on me, like I was the variable he hadn't planned for. Headlights cut through the darkness, sudden and blinding, multiple vehicles pulling up in a line, too precise, too coordinated, doors opening in unison, men stepping out in dark suits moving with a purpose that made my stomach drop. They didn't look at me, they didn't look at Emma, they looked at him. One of them spoke, voice low, but urgent, "Sir, are you all right?" But he didn't answer, he didn't even acknowledge them, his gaze never left mine. "You saved me," he said quietly, like it was a fact, not a question. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to take Emma and leave, to walk away before this became something bigger than a moment, bigger than a mistake. "We should go," I said, pulling my daughter closer, but Emma didn't move. She looked up at him with the kind of open kindness only a child could have. "You're safe now," she told him, and something shifted in his expression, not softer, not exactly, but different enough to notice. He leaned slightly toward her, just enough to be at her level for a brief second, a man surrounded by power lowering himself to meet a child's gaze. Then he looked back at me, and this time there was no distance, no calculation, just certain. "Don't forget debts," he said, and the words settled into the air between us, heavier than anything that had come before. I didn't understand it, not fully, not yet, but I felt it, the weight of something beginning, something I couldn't undo, because that was the moment I realized I hadn't just saved a stranger, I had stepped directly into his world, and he had no intention of letting me walk out of it. I should have walked away the second those black cars appeared, because nothing about that moment felt normal, not the way the engines idled in perfect sync, not the way the men stepped out like they had rehearsed this exact scene 100 times before, not the way the air itself seemed to shift like the night was making space for him. Emma's hand tightened around mine, and I could feel her small fingers trembling. Even though she tried to stay brave, I should have picked her up, I should have left, but my feet would not move, because he was still looking at me like I was the only thing that mattered in a world that clearly revolved around him. One of the men approached cautiously, stopping just short of stepping between us, his voice respectful, careful. "Sir, we need to get you out of here now." Still no response, not to them, not to the urgency in their tone, just to me. "What is your name?" he asked, and it took me a second to realize he was asking me, not them, not anyone else. "Me, Lily," I said before I could stop myself, my voice quieter than I intended, like saying it any louder would give him something I could not take back. His gaze flickered to Emma for a brief moment, then back to me. "Lily," he repeated like he was memorizing it, committing it to something deeper than memory. "You should not be here." Again, that same sentence, but this time it felt different, not a warning, not exactly, more like a statement of fact, like he already knew something I did not. The man beside him cleared his throat, tension creeping into his posture. "Sir, the situation is not secure." That word secure made my stomach twist, because it meant this was not over. Whatever had happened before we arrived, whatever had put him on those tracks, it was still out there, still moving, still unresolved. "We are leaving," I said quickly, pulling Emma closer, forcing my voice to stay steady. "We have to get home." For the first time his attention shifted fully to my daughter. He studied her, not in a way that made me step back, but in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like he was looking at something rare, something he did not often see. "You were not afraid," he said to her, and Emma shook her head, even though I could feel her fear through her grip on my hand. "I was a little," she admitted softly, "but my mom says you help people when you can." My heart stopped for a second, because I did not remember saying that, not like this, not in a way that would lead us here, but he seemed to understand something in those words, something that made his expression change just slightly, enough that I noticed he straightened slowly, the men around him instantly adjusting their positions, as if his movement alone was a command. "Victor," he said without looking away from us, and the man closest to him stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir. Make sure they get home safely." The words landed heavier than they should have, like a simple instruction carried weight I could not measure. "That is not necessary," I said quickly, shaking my head. "We live 10 minutes from here, we are fine." But Victor was already nodding, already moving, already signaling to someone behind him, and suddenly one of the cars shifted closer, headlights cutting across the gravel in a way that made it clear this was not a suggestion. "It is necessary," he said quietly, and for the first time there was something almost human in his tone, not soft, not gentle, but intentional, like he was choosing his words carefully. "You do not understand what you stepped into tonight." And that sentence did something to me, something cold and sharp that settled deep in my chest, because I knew he was right. I did not understand any of it, not the man in front of me, not the people surrounding him, not the way they all moved, like gravity worked differently around him. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, maybe we should go," she whispered, and I nodded, because she was right, because staying here any longer felt like standing too close to something I could not see, but could already feel changing the edges of my life. I turned slightly, guiding her toward the waiting car, but His voice stopped me, Lily. I froze, not because he was loud, not because he demanded it, but because he did not have to. I looked back, slowly meeting his eyes one more time, and there it was again, that same certainty, that same unsettling awareness, like he already knew how this would end before it had even begun. This does not end here, he said simply. No threat, no force, just truth. And somehow that was worse, because threats can be ignored, but truth stays with you. It ends when I say it does. I replied before I could stop myself, the words surprising even me, because I did not talk like that, not to men like him, not to anyone. But something about the way he looked at me made it impossible to stay quiet for a second. The world held its breath. The men around him went still. The air tightened, like I had crossed a line I could not see. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled, not wide, not warm, but real enough to change everything. We will see, he said softly, and then he stepped back, finally breaking whatever invisible hold had kept me there. Victor opened the car door for us, the interior warm compared to the cold outside. Emma climbed in first, looking back at him with curiosity instead of fear, and I followed, my mind racing, my instincts screaming that this was wrong, all of it wrong. The door closed with a heavy sound that felt final. The car pulled away smoothly, the gravel fading behind us as the train tracks disappeared into darkness. I kept my eyes forward, at first forcing myself not to look back, but I could feel it like pressure between my shoulders, like something unfinished calling me to turn. So I did. I glanced through the rear window just once, and he was still there, standing exactly where we left him, surrounded by men and machines and power, but somehow alone. His gaze locked on the car until distance swallowed him whole. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath the entire time. Emma leaned against me, her voice small but certain. He is not like other people. I swallowed hard, staring out at the empty road ahead. No, I said quietly, he is not. And as the city lights began to appear in the distance, something settled inside me, a quiet realization that I could not ignore. That night was not something we would forget. It was something that would come back for us, because men like him did not disappear, and they did not forget. And for some reason I could not explain, I knew he meant every word he said. I did not sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights cutting through darkness, and his voice steady and certain, like he had already decided something about me that I had no control over. Emma slept beside me, curled under a thin blanket, her breathing soft, and even like the world had not shifted beneath our feet. Just hours earlier, I watched her for a long time, memorizing the calm on her face, because I had a feeling it would not last. Morning came too quickly, gray lights slipping through the blinds, painting everything in quiet, dull tones. I moved carefully, not wanting to wake her, as I got ready for my shift at Mercy. General routine should have felt comforting, coffee brewing, the familiar hum of the old refrigerator, the worn sneakers by the door, but everything felt slightly off, like I was walking through a version of my life that no longer fit me. I kept replaying it, the tracks, the train, his eyes, the way those men moved around him, like he was the center of gravity, and we were just something that had briefly crossed his path. I told myself it was over, that people like him did not come looking for people like me, that whatever world he belonged to existed far away from mine, separated by money, power, and choices I had never made. I held on to that thought as I walked Emma to school, her small backpack bouncing lightly with each step. You were quiet today, she said, looking up at me with that same honesty she had used the night before. I forced a small smile. Just tired, I said, which was not a lie, just not the whole truth. She studied me for a second, then nodded like she understood more than I said. He is going to come back, she added casually, like she was talking about the weather. I stopped mid-step, my heart tightening in a way I could not explain. Why would you say that? I asked, keeping my tone light, even though something inside me had already reacted. She shrugged. Because he looked at you like he already knew you. I had no answer for that, so I just squeezed her hand a little tighter and kept walking. After I dropped her off, I headed to the hospital, trying to lose myself in work, because work made sense. Charts, patients, routines, things I could fix, things I could understand. The emergency department was already busy by the time I arrived, the familiar rhythm pulling me in almost immediately, monitors beeping, nurses calling out updates, the controlled chaos I had learned to navigate over the years. For a while it worked, for a while I forgot about him, until I did not. It was just afternoon when the shift changed, and I stepped out into the hallway to grab a moment of quiet. That is when I saw them, two men standing near the entrance, not dressed like patients, not dressed like staff, their suits too precise, their posture too still. They were not looking at anyone specifically, but I knew they were not here by accident. Something in my chest tightened, that same cold awareness from the night before creeping back, and I told myself I was imagining things that hospitals see all kinds of people every day, but then one of them looked directly at me, and everything inside me went still, not aggressive, not threatening, just certain, like he had been waiting for me, specifically Miss Carter. He said, and the way he said my name made it clear this was not a guess. My first instinct was to deny it, to pretend I was someone else, but something told me that would not work with men like this. Yes, I answered slowly, keeping my voice steady. Mr. Volkov would like to speak with you. There it was, his name spoken out loud for the first time, and it settled into the air like something permanent. I glanced around, instinctively aware of how exposed I suddenly felt in a place that had always been safe. I am working, I replied quickly. Then we will not take much of your time. The second man said, his tone polite but firm. Like this was already decided. I hesitated, every part of me telling me to refuse, to walk away, to stay inside the lines of the life I understood, but Emma's voice echoed in my mind. He is going to come back, and somehow I already knew this was what she meant. Where? I asked finally. The first man gestured toward the exit outside. I followed them against my better judgment, each step feeling heavier than the last. The automatic doors slid open, and the cold air hit my face sharp and grounding, and there they were, black cars lined up along the curb, engines quiet, but present, like they were waiting for something more than just a conversation. He stood beside the nearest one, no restraints, no signs of weakness, just the same controlled presence as the night before. Like what happened on those tracks had not touched him at all. His eyes found mine immediately, and that same unsettling feeling returned, like I had stepped into a moment that had already been written. You came, he said simply, and I almost laughed at that, because it sounded like I had a choice. I am on my break, I replied, crossing my arms, slightly trying to create some distance between us. You should not be here. He tilted his head, just slightly considering my words. And yet I am, he said calmly, just like you were last night. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued before I could. I do not believe in coincidence, Lily. Hearing my name again from him felt different this time, heavier, like it carried something more than just recognition. People cross paths for a reason, or by accident. I countered quickly. Some accidents change everything, he said, and for a second the world seemed to narrow to just those words. I shook my head, trying to push back against whatever this was. If you are here to say thank you, then you have already done that, I said firmly. We do not need anything from you. Something flickered in his expression, not anger, not frustration, something closer to interest. That is where you are wrong, he said quietly. You already have something from me. My stomach tightened. I did not take anything, I replied. You took my life, he said, and the way he said it made it impossible to dismiss. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just fact. And I do not ignore debts. There it was again, that word, debt, heavier now, more real. I do not want anything, I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Then that makes you rare, he replied. And there was that almost smile again, the one that made everything feel more complicated than it should have been. He stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. But wanting has nothing to do with this, he added softly. This is about what happens next. And in that moment, I understood something I had been trying to avoid. Since the night before, this was not a conversation. This was the beginning of something I could not control. And as much as I wanted to walk away, I had the sinking feeling that walking away was no longer an option. You do not get to decide what happens next, I said. And for the first time since this started, my voice did not shake, not even a little, because something inside me had finally settled into place. Not fear, not exactly, but a line drawn clear and solid between his world and mine. Adrian Volkov watched me in silence for a moment, like he was recalculating something. Like the version of me he expected did not match the one standing in front of him. Now the city noise moved around us, cars passing, footsteps echoing, distant voices blending into the background, but none of it touched the space between us. Everyone decides something, Lily, he said quietly. They just do not always understand the consequences. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself not to step back, even though every instinct told me to create distance. Then let me be clear, I replied. Whatever happened last night, that ends there. You go back to your world, I go back to mine, and we both pretend this never happened. For a second, I thought he might actually consider it, that maybe this would be the moment where everything returned to normal, where I could walk back through those hospital doors, and this would become just another story I never told. But then he shook his head, one small final. That is not how this Works, he said, and there was no edge in his voice, no threat, just certainty, and somehow that was worse. It is how it works for me. I shot back quickly. You do not own me, you do not get to decide anything about my life. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not even irritation, something closer to recognition, like he had been waiting for me to say exactly that. No. He said slowly, I do not own you. The words should have been reassuring, but the way he said them carried something else, something unfinished. But you are already involved. My stomach tightened again, that same cold awareness from before creeping back in. Involved in what? I asked, even though part of me did not want to know. He glanced briefly toward the street, then back at me like he was deciding how much to say. What happened last night was not random, he said, and the people responsible do not like loose ends. I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me, not physically, but in that subtle way reality changes when you realize you are standing in something bigger than you understood. We did not see anything, I said quickly. We were just passing by. We helped and left. That is it. That is not how they will see it, he replied calmly. You were there, you intervened, and now you are connected whether you want to be or not. I shook my head, stepping back this time, unable to hold my ground anymore. No, that is not my problem, I said. I did not ask for any of this. No, you did not, he agreed, but you made a choice. And there it was again, that word choice, like everything came back to that moment on the tracks, like one decision had rewritten everything that came after. So what are you saying? I asked, my voice lower, now more cautious. That I am in danger. He did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said. I felt my chest tighten, my thoughts jumping immediately to Emma, her school, her routine, the fragile normal life I had built around her. You are under my protection now, he said finally, and the words hit harder than anything else because they sounded like help, but felt like a chain. I did not ask for protection, I replied sharply. And I do not need it. Everyone needs it, he said. They just do not always know from what. I turned away from him for a second, pressing my fingers against my temple, trying to think, trying to find some version of this that made sense. This is not real. I muttered more to myself than to him. This does not just happen to people like me. It already did, he said quietly behind me, and I closed my eyes for a brief second because he was right. Whether I liked it or not, whether I accepted it or not, something had already changed. I could feel it in the way the world seemed sharper, now louder, more unpredictable, like a crack had formed in the surface of everything I trusted. I turned back to him slowly. I have a daughter, I said, and this time my voice did shake, just a little, because that was the truth that mattered more than anything else. She is not part of this. She will never be part of this. Something shifted in his expression again, not softer, not exactly, but more focused, like my words had moved something important into place. She already is, he said, and I felt that sentence like a physical impact because it crossed a line I could not ignore. Do not say that, I snapped, stepping closer now, anger cutting through the fear. Do not you ever say that about her. The men around him tensed slightly, but he did not move. He just watched me like he was measuring the weight of my reaction. I am not threatening her, he said calmly. I am telling you the truth. The moment she stood beside you last night, she became part of this, whether you accept it or not. I shook my head again, but it felt weaker this time, like I was trying to push back something that would not move. Then fix it, I said quickly. You said you owe me, then fix it, make it go away, make all of this go away. For the first time something real crossed his face, something almost human, something that looked a lot like conflict. If it were that simple, I would have done it already, he said, and there was a quiet honesty in that statement that made it harder to argue. Then what do you want from me? I asked, and there it was, the question I had been avoiding since the moment he said my name on those tracks. What did he actually want? He stepped closer again, just enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us, not threatening, not forceful, just present. I want you safe, he said simply, and the only way that happens is if you stop pretending this is not real. I stared at him, searching for something, anything that would make this make sense, but all I found was certainty, the same certainty that had been there from the beginning. And what happens if I do not listen to you? I asked quietly. He held my gaze for a long second before answering. Then I will make sure you are safe anyway. And there it was, not a threat, not exactly, but not a choice either. And as I stood there outside the hospital with cars passing and people walking by, unaware of anything that was happening between us, I realized something that settled deep in my chest like a truth. I could not escape. This was no longer about whether I wanted to be part of his world. It was about the fact that somehow, without meaning to, without understanding how, I had already stepped into it. And now it was not letting me go. I walked back into the hospital like nothing had changed, but every sound felt sharper, every movement more deliberate, like I was suddenly aware of things I had never noticed before, the way people passed by, without looking, the way doors opened and closed, the way footsteps echoed just a little too long. I kept expecting to turn around and see one of his men standing there watching, waiting, but there was nothing, just the same fluorescent lights, the same worn floors, the same controlled chaos that had always grounded me, except now it did not feel like safety. It felt like something temporary, like a place I was borrowing time from. I tried to focus on work. I really did: charts, patience, vitals, simple tasks that used to anchor me. But my mind kept pulling back to him, to the way he said, "You are under my protection," like it was not an offer, like it was already decided. By the time my shift ended, my head was pounding from trying to think my way out of something I did not understand. I stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the sky dimming into that soft gray before sunset, and for a brief second I allowed myself to hope that maybe this was over, that maybe he had said what he needed to say and would disappear back into whatever world he came from. But the moment I reached the curb, that hope vanished, because the cars were still there, not as many this time, just one parked quietly like it belonged there, like it had always been there, the engine running low, steady. I stopped a few feet away, my body going still without me telling it to. The back door opened before I could decide what to do, and his voice came from inside, calm, controlled. "Get in, Lily." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly. "No," I said, keeping my distance. "I am going home." There was a pause, just long enough to make the air feel heavier. Then he stepped out of the car himself, closing the distance between us in a way that felt intentional, not rushed, not aggressive, just certain. "And I am making sure you get there safely," he replied, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I crossed my arms, instinctively holding my ground. "You do not need to do that," I said. "I have been getting home just fine for years." "That was before," he said simply, and again those words carried more weight than they should have. "Before what?" "Before I met you, before I stepped into something I cannot see." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You cannot just follow me around like this," I said. "This is not normal." "No," he agreed. "It is not for a moment." Neither of us moved. The city continued around us, people passing, cars driving, life going on like nothing unusual was happening. But inside that small space between us, everything felt different, like time had slowed just enough for me to realize this was not something I could ignore. "I have to pick up my daughter," I said finally, and the moment her existence entered the conversation again, his expression shifted, not softer, not gentler, but more focused, like everything else faded, and only that mattered. "We will pick her up together," he said, and something about that word "together" made my chest tighten. "No," I said immediately. "You are not coming anywhere near her school." This time he did not argue right away. He studied me for a second, like he was recalculating again, adjusting to a boundary he had not expected. "Then I will wait here," he said, "and you will bring her to me." I let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because the absurdity of it hit all at once. "That is not happening either," I replied. "You do not get to insert yourself into my life like this." "I already have," he said quietly. And there it was again, that same truth I kept trying to push away. I shook my head, stepping back again, creating space, because I needed it, because standing too close to him made everything feel too real. "Listen to me," I said more firmly now. "I appreciate what you think you are doing, but this ends here. You go your way, I go mine, and that is it." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I could see it clearly now, the difference between us, not just money, not just power, but certainty. He moved through the world like everything had a place, like outcomes were things he decided, not things that happened to him. And I hated that part of me noticed it, because it made everything harder. "You are not hearing me," he said finally. "This is not about what you want." "Then what is it about?" I shot back, frustration breaking through, because from where I am standing it looks like control. Something shifted in his expression at that word, not anger, but recognition, like I had named something he was used to hearing, but not from someone like me. "It is about survival," he said, and this time there was something different in his voice, something quieter, something that did not feel like control at all. "Yours and hers." I went still, because that was the first time he had said it like that, directly, like it was not just a possibility, but a fact, and suddenly the world did not feel as steady as it had a second ago. I thought about Emma again, about her walking out of school alone, about the normal routine I had trusted for years, and for the first time doubt slipped in, small but sharp. "What exactly are we dealing with?" I asked more quietly now, and he did not hesitate. "People who do not make mistakes twice." he said, and the simplicity of that answer made it worse because it left too much unsaid, too much unknown. I swallowed hard, my mind racing through possibilities I did not want to consider, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt it fear real and undeniable, not for me, but for her. And he saw the exact second it appeared, because his expression shifted again, just slightly enough that I noticed. I told you, he said softly. You do not understand what you stepped into. I looked away from him for a second, pressing my lips together, trying to think, trying to find a way to keep control of something, anything. But the truth was I was running out of options, and I knew it when I looked back at him. He was still there, still waiting, not pushing, not forcing, just present, like he knew this moment would come, like he had been standing here since the beginning, waiting for me to see what he already understood, and for the first time since this started, I did not argue, I did not push back, I just stood there, caught between the life I had built and the one that was suddenly pressing in around me, realizing that maybe the most dangerous thing about all of this was not him or the people he was talking about, but the fact that a part of me was starting to believe him. I did not say yes, but I did not say no either, and somehow that silence felt louder than anything else that had been said. Between us, Adrian Volkov watched me carefully, like he understood exactly what that hesitation meant, like he had been waiting for it from the very beginning. What time does she get out? He asked, and the fact that he moved forward without waiting for permission should have made me push back again, should have made me walk away, but it did not, because the image in my head had already changed from inconvenience to risk, from control to something I could not fully name. 3:15. I answered quietly before I could stop myself, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew something had shifted, something I could not undo. He nodded once, like that settled something important. We will leave now, he said, and turned toward the car like it was already decided. I stood there for a second longer, trying to gather whatever control I had left before following him, not because I wanted to, but because the alternative suddenly felt less certain. The car door opened, and I hesitated just for a moment before getting in. The interior was warm, quiet, insulated from the noise of the city, like stepping into a different world entirely. The door closed behind me with a soft but final sound, and the car moved almost immediately, smooth, controlled, like everything about it was designed to avoid disruption. I sat rigid at first, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my mind racing through every possible outcome, every scenario that could still end with me walking away from this. But the longer I sat there, the harder it became to hold on to that idea. Adrian sat beside me, not too close, not distant either, just present, like everything about him existed in deliberate balance. You are thinking about leaving, he said without looking at me, and I turned my head, slightly surprised that he said it out loud. I am thinking about my daughter, I corrected quickly, because that was the truth that mattered. And what happens to her if you are wrong? He replied, and that question settled heavily between us, because it was the one I had been avoiding, the one I did not want to answer, because answering it meant admitting that he might be right. I looked out the window, watching the city blur past familiar streets, suddenly feeling different, like they belonged to someone else. You do not know anything about us, I said after a moment, trying to reclaim something. Anything. You do not know what we need, what we can handle. I know enough, he said calmly. I know that you would not have run toward danger if you did not believe it was the right thing to do, and I know that people like you do not stop believing that even when they should. I frowned slightly, turning back toward him, because that sounded less like observation and more like understanding, and I did not like that he was getting that close to something real. People like me, I repeated. You mean people without options? For the first time he looked at me directly, his expression steady, but something in his eyes shifted, like I had touched on something deeper than I intended. No, he said quietly. People with principles. The word caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not from him, not from someone who moved through the world the way he did. Principles do not pay rent, I replied quickly, the edge in my voice sharper than before, because I needed distance from whatever that moment was. No, he agreed again. But they decide who you become. I looked away again, because I did not want to think about that. Not right now, not when everything felt unstable enough. Already the car slowed slightly as we turned onto a quieter street, one I recognized immediately. The school was just ahead, a small brick building with a fenced playground and a row of parents already gathering near the entrance. The sight of it grounded me instantly. This was real, this was normal, this was the life I understood. Stop here, I said quickly as the car approached, and it came to a smooth halt a short distance from the curb. I reached for the door handle, but his voice stopped me again, not forceful, just enough to make me pause. Lily, I turned back reluctantly, meeting his gaze. You do not let her out of your sight, he said, and this time there was no ambiguity, no layered meaning, just a direct instruction that landed with more weight than anything else he had said. I never do, I replied quietly, and he held my gaze for a second longer like he was measuring the truth in that statement before nodding. Once I stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting my face as the sounds of children and parents filled the space around me, laughter, voices, backpacks, rustling, normal life exactly where I had left it, but it did not feel the same anymore, not after everything I had just heard. I walked toward the gate, scanning the crowd automatically, until I saw her, Emma, standing near the steps, her small frame easy to spot even in the middle of everything else. Her face lit up the moment she saw me, and she ran toward me without hesitation. Mom, she called, and I knelt down, catching her as she reached me, holding her a little tighter than usual before pulling back just enough to look at her properly. How was your day? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Good, she said quickly. We had art, and I drew a bird, and Mrs. Parker said it was very good. I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, trying to hold on to this moment, this normal moment, as long as I could. That sounds perfect, I said, and she looked past me, then her expression shifting slightly. Is he here? She asked quietly, and my heart skipped a beat. Because even without seeing him, she knew, even without being told, she felt it too. I followed her gaze instinctively back, toward the car parked down the street, and for a brief second our worlds overlapped completely, the quiet normal of a school afternoon, and the controlled presence of something else waiting just outside of it. Yes, I said finally, my voice softer now. He is here. Emma looked back at me, her expression thoughtful, not afraid, just aware in a way that made her seem older than she was. Is he going to help us? She asked, and I hesitated because I did not know how to answer that. Not yet, not fully, because help from someone like him did not come without something attached. And I was just beginning to understand that when I looked back toward the car again. I saw him step out, his figure still composed, still controlled, but somehow less distant than before, like each step he took toward us was closing a gap that should have never existed, and in that moment, standing between my daughter and a man I did not fully understand, I realized something that settled deep and unshakable inside me. This was no longer just about survival, it was about trust, and I had no idea if that was something I could afford to give. Emma did not wait for me to answer. She stepped slightly forward, her small hand slipping out of mine, as if something in her had already decided, and that alone made my chest tighten, because children do not move toward danger unless they do not recognize it, and somehow that was worse. Adrian Volkov closed the distance, slowly, not rushed, not imposing, just steady, like every step was measured against something only he understood. The other parents barely noticed him. A few glanced in his direction, then looked away, like their instincts told them not to focus too long on something that did not belong in their world. He stopped a few feet away from us, not too close, not distant either, and for the first time since I had seen him, he lowered himself slightly, bringing his height down just enough to meet Emma at eye level. You made it home safely, he said to her, his voice quieter, now less sharp than before. Emma nodded without hesitation, her eyes studying him in that open way only children can. You did too, she replied simply, and something in his expression shifted, not soft exactly, but less guarded, like her presence altered something in him that the rest of the world could not reach. I stepped forward, instinctively placing myself between them, not blocking him, but creating a boundary that needed to exist. We are leaving now, I said firmly, my voice calm but final. He looked up at me, then not offended, not surprised, just acknowledging the line I had drawn. Of course, he said, and stood back up smoothly, his attention returning to me with that same intensity that made everything feel too focused, too real. I will follow behind, he added, like it was a compromise, like he understood enough to give me space without stepping away completely. I hesitated for a second, wanting to argue, wanting to say no again, but Emma's presence grounded me, and the reality of everything he had said earlier pressed in quietly. I nodded once, sharp and controlled. Fine, I said, then took Emma's hand again, leading her toward the sidewalk, away from the school, away from the eyes of other parents who would never understand what was happening. Just a few feet away, we walked in silence, at first the sound of our footsteps steady against the pavement. Emma glanced back once, then looked up at me. He is different when he talks to me, she said softly, and I swallowed, because she was right. I had seen it too, that subtle shift, that almost softness that did not fit with anything else about him. People can act different around kids, I said carefully, choosing my words, It does not always mean they are safe. She thought about that for a second, then nodded slowly, but I could tell she was not fully convinced, and that scared me more than anything else because trust once given is hard to take back. We reached our apartment building 10 minutes later, the familiar worn steps and chipped paint grounding me again, reminding me of the life I had built piece by piece. Without anyone's help, I unlocked the door, quickly ushering Emma inside. Before turning back toward the street, the car was still there, parked across from the building engine. Low lights dim, Adrian stepped out again. Not approaching this time, just standing near the car like he understood this was as far as he was allowed for now. I held his gaze for a moment through the distance, trying to read something, anything that would make this make sense, but all I saw was the same certainty, the same quiet control that had followed him since the beginning. I stepped inside and closed the door, firmly locking it behind me, the sound louder than it should have been, like it meant more than just security. Emma dropped her backpack near the couch, already moving toward the kitchen, like everything was normal, like this was just another afternoon. "Can I have juice?" she asked, and I nodded automatically, my mind still outside, still on the man standing across the street. I poured her a glass, my hands steady out of habit, even though everything else felt anything but. "Are we safe?" she asked suddenly, and I froze for a second, because children do not ask questions like that unless they feel something is different, something is wrong. I turned to her slowly, forcing my expression to stay calm. "Yes," I said gently, "we are safe." And I wanted that to be true. I needed it to be true, but the words felt heavier now, like they carried doubt I could not ignore. She nodded, accepting it for now, and moved to the couch, turning on the television, like she always did, like routine could fix what had shifted. I walked to the window, slowly, my eyes drawn back to the street, without me telling them to, and he was still there, exactly where I left him, not moving, not leaving, just watching, not in a way that felt threatening, not exactly, but in a way that made it clear he was not going anywhere anytime soon. I crossed my arms, unconsciously, my mind racing through everything he had said, everything I had felt, everything that no longer made sense. This was not protection, not the kind I understood. This was something else, something that came with presence, with control, with a quiet claim that had never been spoken out loud, but existed anyway. I stayed there for a long moment, just watching him, and then something unexpected happened. He looked away, not long, not dramatic, just a brief shift, like he was giving me something I did not expect. Space. That small action changed something in me, just slightly, because it meant he was not just taking control, he was choosing when to step back. And that was different. That was something I could not easily define. Behind me, Emma laughed softly at something on the television, the sound light, normal, grounding, and I held on to it, because it reminded me what mattered, what I had to protect, no matter what. I turned away from the window, finally forcing myself to step back into the room, back into the life I understood, but the feeling did not leave. It stayed there, quiet and persistent, like a thread pulling everything tighter, because even though I had closed the door, even though I had locked it, even though I had told myself we were safe, I knew something had already crossed the line, something I could not see, something I could not undo. And the worst part was I was no longer sure if the danger was outside that door or already inside my life. I told myself I would not look again, but I did. Because something about knowing he was still there pulled at me in a way I could not ignore. The street outside had grown quieter, the late afternoon fading into evening, lights flickering on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement, and his car remained exactly where it had been parked, like time did not move the same way around him. I stood by the window longer than I should have, watching, without meaning to, watching like I was trying to understand something that could not be explained. Emma's voice drifted from the couch, soft and distant, asking a question about dinner, something normal, something small, and I answered automatically, my words coming out steady, even though my thoughts were anything but. I moved through the apartment like I always did, setting things in place, preparing a simple meal, going through motions I had repeated 1,000 times before. But tonight, everything felt slightly off, like I was performing a version of my life instead of living it. The awareness never left, the quiet knowledge that just outside my door sat a man who had stepped into my world without asking and now refused to step out. Emma noticed it again, of course. She did. She always noticed things I tried to hide. "You keep looking," she said softly, and I paused mid-movement, forcing a small smile as I turned toward her, "Just making sure everything is fine," I replied, and she studied me for a second, longer than usual, before nodding slowly, like she accepted it, but did not fully believe it. We ate together at the small table near the window, the sound of forks against plates filling the silence between us. I kept my back turned to the street, at first refusing to look again, refusing to give him that space in my mind, but eventually. Curiosity or something stronger pulled me back. I glanced out quickly, just once, and he was still there, except this time something was different. He was not standing beside the car anymore. He was leaning slightly against it, one hand resting casually at his side, his posture relaxed in a way that made it seem like he could stay there all night if he needed to, not impatient, not restless, just present. And that made it worse, because it meant this was not temporary, this was not something that would fade. With time, this was something deliberate, something chosen. Is he cold? Emma asked suddenly, and I blinked, taken off guard by the question. What? I said, and she nodded toward the window. He has been outside for a long time. I followed her gaze again instinctively, and for a moment I saw it from her perspective, not as a threat, not as control, but as a man standing alone in the cold, waiting, and something about that shifted the way it felt, just slightly enough to confuse me. He can leave if he wants to, I said quietly, and Emma tilted her head, considering that. But he does not, she replied simply, and there was no argument to that, no easy explanation. I finished dinner quickly after that, my appetite gone, replaced by something heavier, something harder to name. Emma went to her room soon after, routine guiding her toward normalcy, brushing her teeth, changing into pajamas, asking for the same story she always asked for, and I gave it to her, my voice steady, my tone calm, like nothing had changed, like the world outside our walls was still the same safe, predictable place she believed it to be. By the time I tucked her into bed, she was already half asleep, her small hand holding on to mine for just a second longer than usual before letting go. He is not scary, she murmured softly, her eyes barely open, and I froze, because that was not what I expected, not what I wanted her to feel. You do not know that, I whispered, gently brushing her hair back from her face, and she smiled faintly. You are not scared of him, she said, and I did not answer because I did not know if that was true. I turned off the light and stepped out of her room, closing the door quietly behind me, and the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. I walked back to the window, slowly drawn there again despite everything, and when I looked outside, he was still there, exactly where he had been, like nothing had changed, like he had not moved at all. Time passed, minutes, maybe longer. I did not check, I just stood there watching, and then without thinking I grabbed my jacket, the decision forming before I could question it. I moved toward the door, unlocking it with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. Stepping out into the cool night air, the city felt different now, quieter, more distant, like everything had pulled back, leaving just this moment, just this space between us. He looked up the second I stepped outside, like he had been waiting for it, like he knew I would come eventually, and I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms instinctively, more for control than warmth. You are still here, I said, and it came out softer than I intended. He straightened slightly, pushing himself off the car, his attention fully on me. I told you, he said simply, this does not end here. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cold air. You cannot stay out here all night, I said, and it sounded like a statement, but felt like something else, something closer to concern, and I hated that I heard it in my own voice. I can, he replied calmly, and for a second I believed him completely, because he was the kind of man who did not say things he could not follow through on. I shook my head slightly, stepping closer before I could stop myself. Why? I asked quietly, and this time I needed the answer, not the version he had given me before, not the controlled explanation, but the truth. He held my gaze for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted again, that same subtle change I had noticed before when Emma spoke to him, when something real broke through the control. Because you are not just a responsibility to me, he said, and the words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything else that had come before. Then what am I? I asked before I could stop myself, and for the first time since this started, he did not answer right away. He just looked at me like the answer mattered, like saying it would change something neither of us fully understood, and in that silence I felt it clearly, the shift from obligation to something else, something more dangerous, because it was not defined. And I realized, standing there in the cold with the night pressing in around us, that whatever this was, it was no longer just about safety or survival. It was becoming something personal, and that was the moment I understood that walking away was not the hardest part, staying might be. He did not answer right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make my chest tighten, because I realized I was waiting for it, waiting for whatever word he would choose to define something that should not exist between us. The night air felt colder, now, the kind that settles into your bones and makes everything sharper, clearer, more real. That depends on what you choose to be, he said finally, and the answer was not an answer at all. It was something else, something that pushed the decision back onto me like he was handing me a door I did not know how to open. I frowned slightly, taking a step back, creating space because I needed it, because standing too close to him made everything feel like it was moving too fast. I did not choose any of this, I said, and my voice was steady again. But underneath it something else had started to shift, something less certain than before. You chose to stop that night, he replied calmly. You chose to act when you could have walked away. That does not mean I chose this, I countered, quickly gesturing between us, the car, the distance, the invisible weight that had been building since the tracks. No, he said, but it means you are not the kind of person who ignores consequences. I let out a slow breath because he kept doing that, turning everything back to that moment like it was the center of everything, like nothing else mattered before or after. And what exactly are the consequences? I asked quietly, and this time he did not hesitate. People are already looking for answers, he said. They know something changed. That night they just do not know what yet. My stomach tightened again, that same cold awareness creeping back in. And you think they will come after me? I asked. I do not think, he said. I know how they operate. I looked away for a second, my mind racing through everything he had said, everything I had tried to dismiss, and for the first time it felt less like a warning and more like a reality. I could not ignore. The street around us was quiet now, the few passing cars distant, the city settling into night, and it made everything feel more isolated, like we were the only two people left in a moment that had stretched too far. Then tell me what to do, I said finally, and the words felt heavier than anything I had said before, because they meant something, because they crossed a line I had been holding on to since the beginning. He studied me for a second, like he was measuring the weight of that shift, like he understood exactly what it meant for me to say that. For now, he said slowly, you do what? You always do. You keep your routine, you stay where you are expected to be, and you let me handle everything else. I shook my head slightly because that sounded simple, too simple for something that felt this complicated. And what does that mean exactly? I asked. It means you trust me, he said, and there it was again, that word, the one I had been avoiding since the beginning, because trust was not something you gave to someone like him, not easily, not without knowing what it would cost. I do not know you, I replied quietly, and for the first time since this started his expression shifted in a way that felt almost personal, like that statement mattered more than anything else I had said. You know enough, he said, and there was something in his voice now, something less controlled, less distant. You know that I will not let anything happen to you or your daughter. I held his gaze for a long second, searching for something, anything that would tell me whether to believe that, and the truth was I did not know. I did not know him. I did not understand his world. I did not know what he was capable of or what he was not, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the way he had looked at Emma, the way he had stepped back when I asked him to, the way he had stayed outside instead of forcing his way in, and none of that fit with the image I had built in my head. Why? I asked softly, and this time the question was not about circumstances or danger, it was about him, about the reason behind everything he had done. Why are you doing this? He did not answer immediately again, but this silence felt different, less calculated, more uncertain, like he was choosing his words more carefully than before. Because you changed something that night, he said finally, and his voice was quieter now, not weak, not unsure, just honest in a way I had not heard from him before. People do not usually step into my world and walk away from it. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what that meant. That is not a reason, I said. It is enough for me, he replied, and I exhaled slowly because that was not something I could argue with, not when I did not understand the rules he lived by. This is not going to be simple, I said after a moment, and it felt like a warning, not just for him, but for myself. No, he agreed, it will not. The honesty in that answer surprised me more than anything else because it meant he was not trying to make this easier than it was. He was not pretending this would resolve itself neatly. He was just standing there offering something I did not fully understand and asking me to step into it. I looked back toward the building behind me, the light from my apartment window faint but steady. Emma was inside, safe for now, waiting for me to come back. And that was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could not be compromised. I turned back to him one more time, my decision not fully formed, but no longer uncertain. You do not come inside, I said firmly. You do not speak to her unless I am there, and you do not make decisions about my life without telling me first. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady, his attention fully on me, like every word mattered. And if I say no, I added, then it is no. There was a brief pause, and then he nodded once, not reluctant, not resistant, just accepting, agreed. He said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard because I expected resistance, I expected negotiation, but there was none, just that single word that carried more weight than anything else. And in return he added, "You do not ignore me when I tell you something matters." I hesitated for a second, then nodded once, because that was the closest thing to balance we were going to get. "Fine," I said. Quietly, and the moment the agreement settled between us, something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to feel like the ground had moved slightly beneath my feet, like a new line had been drawn, one I had stepped over. Without fully realizing it, I took a step back, then another, creating distance again, because I needed it, because I needed to remind myself where I stood. "Good night," I said, turning toward the door before I could second-guess anything, before I could let this become something more than it already was. "Good night, Lily," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, something quieter, something that stayed with me longer than it should have. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, the lock clicking into place like it always did, like it meant the same thing it always had. But as I leaned back against it for just a second longer than usual, I realized something that settled deep and undeniable inside me. Tonight was not an ending, it was the beginning of something I had just agreed to, without fully understanding. And for the first time since all of this started, I was no longer just reacting, I was choosing, and that made everything more dangerous than before. I did not expect to sleep, but I did eventually, not deeply, not peacefully, but enough for time to pass, without me noticing the exact moment exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke up, the room was quiet, the soft gray of early morning filtering through the blinds, the kind of light that usually felt calm, predictable, safe. But today it felt different, like the world had shifted slightly overnight. Without asking my permission, I sat up, slowly listening for any sound that did not belong, any movement outside, any sign that something had changed again. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the city waking up and the quiet rhythm of Emma breathing in the next room. I got up, carefully moving through the apartment like I always did, checking the locks out of habit more than fear, even though fear had started to take a different shape, now not loud, not obvious, just present like a thought I could not quite shake. I made coffee, the familiar routine grounding me. For a moment, the smell, the warmth, the simple act of pouring it into a chipped mug that had been mine for years, things that belonged to my life before all of this. I walked to the window, without thinking about it, my eyes drawn there automatically, and for a brief second I did not see him. The street looked normal, empty, in that early morning way where everything feels paused. And I let out a breath. I did not realize I was holding. Maybe he had left, maybe whatever this was had ended the way I kept hoping it would, quietly, without pulling me any deeper into it. But then I noticed the car parked a little farther down the street, less obvious than before, positioned in a way that made it easy to miss if you were not looking for it. And that was when I understood he had not left, he had adjusted, and something about that made my chest tighten, because it meant he was thinking ahead, it meant he was not reacting, he was planning. Emma's voice broke through my thoughts, soft and sleepy. "Mom," she called, and I turned away from the window, immediately forcing myself back into the moment, back into what mattered. She walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, her hair slightly messy the way it always was in the morning, and I knelt down, brushing it back gently. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone light, like everything was the same, like nothing had changed. "Is he still here?" she asked, and I paused just long enough to feel the weight of the question before answering. "He is nearby," I said carefully, and she nodded like that made sense, like she had already expected it. "Okay," she replied simply, and moved toward the table, like it was just another piece of information, another part of the day we had to work around. I watched her for a second longer than usual, realizing how quickly she had adapted, how easily she had accepted something that I was still trying to understand, and that both impressed me and scared me at the same time. We went through the morning routine, breakfast, packed lunches, getting ready for school, everything moving in the same rhythm it always had, but underneath it, there was something else, something quieter, something that made every moment feel slightly more fragile. As we stepped outside, the cool morning air hit my face sharp and clear. The street looked ordinary, neighbors heading to work, cars passing by, people moving through their lives unaware of anything beyond their own routines. But I knew better now. I knew how quickly that sense of normal could shift. I held Emma's hand a little tighter as we walked, and I did not miss the way the car down the street started moving a few seconds after we did not close, not obvious, just they're maintaining distance in a way that felt intentional, controlled. Emma noticed it too, of course. She did. She glanced back once, then looked up at me. "He is following us again," she said quietly, and I nodded because there was no point pretending. Otherwise, he is making sure we are safe, I replied, and the words felt different coming out of my mouth now, less like resistance, more like something I was beginning to accept. We reached the school. Without incident, the same small crowd of parents, the same routine of drop-offs and quick conversations, but I was more aware this time, more alert to everything around me, every unfamiliar face, every movement that did not quite fit. I knelt down in front of Emma, adjusting her jacket slightly just to have a reason to hold on to the moment a little longer. You stay with your teacher, I said gently. Do not wander off, do not go anywhere alone. She nodded seriously. I know, she said. And then after a pause, he will be watching, right? I hesitated for a second, then nodded yes, I said, and she smiled faintly, like that reassured her, like that made everything okay. She hugged me quickly, then ran off toward the building, her small figure disappearing into the flow of children, and for a moment I just stood there watching until she was completely inside, until I could not see her anymore. Only then did I turn back toward the street. The car was still there, parked a little farther away than before, less noticeable, but present. And as I watched, Adrian stepped out again, his movements calm, controlled, like nothing about this was unusual, like standing outside a school in the early morning was just another part of his routine. He did not approach right away. He waited, giving me space, like he had learned something from the night before, like he understood that pushing too hard would only make me pull away. I walked toward him slowly, closing the distance on my terms this time. And when I stopped a few feet away, he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Everything is as it should be, he said quietly, and I almost smiled at that, because nothing about this felt like it should be anything. That depends on your definition, I replied, crossing my arms lightly, but there was less resistance in the gesture than before, less distance. It means nothing unexpected has happened, he clarified, and I nodded because that was something I could accept for now. And if something does, I asked, and he met my gaze steadily, then I handle it before it reaches you. There it was again, that certainty, that control, that promise that felt both reassuring and dangerous at the same time. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing, just slightly despite myself, because part of me wanted to believe that, part of me needed to believe that this is not how my life works, I said after a moment, and he tilted his head slightly. It is how it works now, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer settled into the space between us like something final. Like something I could not argue with, not anymore, not after everything that had already changed. I looked back toward the school one more time, then back at him, and for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was standing outside of it looking in. I felt like I was already inside it, like the line I had been holding on to was no longer there. And as I stood there in the quiet morning light, with the city moving around us and him standing steady in front of me, I realized something that I had been trying not to see. This was no longer temporary. This was not something that would pass or fade. This was becoming part of my life, and whether I wanted it or not, I was beginning to adapt to it. By the time I left the school parking lot that morning, I could feel it clearly. Something had shifted again, not outside, not in the world around me, but inside me. The way I was thinking, the way I was reacting, the way I was no longer trying to pretend this would disappear. Adrian did not follow me this time, not directly. At least I noticed the difference immediately, the absence of that quiet shadow behind me, the subtle distance that had always been there. And for a brief moment, I wondered if that was his version of trust, if stepping back was as intentional as stepping forward. I drove to the hospital in silence, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind moving through possibilities instead of resisting them. And that alone felt different. When I walked into Mercy General, everything looked the same. The same bright lights, the same hurried footsteps, the same voices calling out across the halls, but I did not feel the same. I noticed things now, patterns, small details I had ignored before, the way certain people lingered a second too long, the way unfamiliar faces stood out against a routine I knew by heart. It was not paranoia, it was awareness, something he had placed into my world without asking, something I was starting to understand. As the day moved on, I worked like I always did, patient after patient, task after task, but my focus was sharper, my instincts quicker, like I was seeing beyond what was in front of me. And then, around mid-afternoon, something small happened, something that would have meant nothing before, but now it stopped me cold. A man stood near the nurse's station, not sick, not injured, just standing, watching, not directly at anyone, but not watching either. His posture too still, his eyes moving just enough to take everything in. I felt it immediately, that same quiet tension from before, the same awareness that something did not belong. I did not react right A way I did not call attention to it, I just observed the way he shifted his weight, the way his gaze flickered toward me once then away like he had seen enough. And that was when I understood this was not random, this was not coincidence. My pulse quickened slightly, but my movement stayed calm, controlled. I turned back to my chart, finishing what I was doing before stepping away, naturally like nothing had changed, but inside everything had. I moved toward a quieter hallway, my hand already reaching for my phone before I even realized I was doing it. I stared at the screen for a second, his number already there, like it had been waiting for this moment, like I had been waiting for it. I hesitated just once, then pressed call. It rang only once before he answered. Lily, his voice came through steady, immediate, like he had been expecting it. There is someone here, I said quietly, keeping my tone, even keeping my breathing controlled. He does not belong. There was a brief pause, not long, not uncertain, just enough for something to shift on his end. Where, he asked, and I told him the location, my eyes scanning the hallway instinctively, even though I knew I was not alone. Not anymore. Stay where you are, he said, and there was something different in his voice. Now something sharper, more focused. Do not engage, do not approach, I will handle it. I leaned slightly against the wall, my grip tightening around the phone, just enough to feel it. You are not here, I said before I could stop myself. And the words came out quieter than I intended. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to it. I am closer than you think, he replied, and something about that settled into me immediately, not completely, not enough to erase the tension, but enough to steady it. I ended the call and stayed where I was, just like he said, my mind alert, my senses tuned to every sound, every movement. Seconds passed, maybe longer. I did not check time, felt different again, stretched thin between moments. Then I heard it, footsteps, not hurried, not heavy, just precise. And I knew before I saw them that it was not random, that it was him, or someone connected to him. Two men moved through the hallway, not dressed like staff, not patients, their presence quiet but undeniable. They did not look at me directly, but I felt it the same way I had before, like they knew exactly where I was without needing to search. I stayed still, just watching from a distance, as they moved past the nurse's station toward where I had seen the man earlier, and within moments something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to feel the tension shift, like a thread had been pulled tight and then released. The man was no longer there. I did not see him leave. I did not see anything happen, but he was gone, and the space he occupied felt different, emptier, quieter, like whatever had been there had been removed completely. I let out a slow breath, realizing only then how tightly I had been holding it. My phone buzzed in my hand, a message from Adrian, simple, direct. It is handled. I stared at the screen for a second, longer than necessary, the words settling into me heavier than they should have, because they meant something. They meant he had been right. They meant this was real. I looked back down the hallway, the normal sounds of the hospital returning, filling the space like nothing had happened, like it had all been imagined. But I knew better now. I understood the difference between normal and safe, and they were not the same thing. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, my hand steady again. But something inside me had shifted further than before, something that no longer resisted what this was becoming. When my shift ended later that day, I walked outside with a different awareness. The air felt sharper, the world clearer, and when I saw the car waiting this time, I did not hesitate. I walked toward it without stopping, without questioning, and when Adrian stepped out to meet me, his gaze searching mine for something, I did not look away. You were right, I said quietly, and the words felt like more than just an acknowledgement. They felt like acceptance, like a line I had been standing on had finally been crossed completely. And as I stood there facing him, no longer resisting, no longer pretending this was temporary, I realized something that settled deep and unshakable inside me. This was not just his world anymore. It was becoming mine too. The way he looked at me when I said you were right was not satisfaction. It was not victory. It was something quieter, something that settled deeper than either of those, like a piece of a puzzle finally falling into place without needing to be forced. I do not need you to agree with me, Adrian said calmly. I need you to understand what is happening around you. I nodded slowly, because for the first time I did understand, not completely, not every detail, but enough to know this was not something I could walk away from anymore. Then tell me everything, I said, and the words felt different coming out of me, not hesitant, not resistant, just direct. His expression shifted slightly, at that, not surprised, but attentive, like he had been waiting for that moment for me to ask. Instead of push back, he opened the car door without another word, and this time I did not hesitate. I got in. The interior felt familiar, now not comfortable, but no longer foreign. The door closed, and the city noise faded instantly, leaving just the quiet, controlled space. Between us, he sat beside me, his posture the same, composed and steady, but there was something different in the air, now something less guarded, like the distance between us had changed in a way neither of us could ignore. There are people who expected me not to survive that night. He began, his voice even measured, like he was laying out facts, not telling a story. When that expectation failed, they started looking for what went wrong. I listened without interrupting, my focus sharper than it had ever been, because this mattered, because this was the part one needed to understand. They do not know it was you, he continued, but they know something interfered, and that is enough for them to start asking questions. I leaned back slightly, processing that, letting it settle into something I could work with. So we are not their target, I said carefully, and he shook his head once. Not yet, he replied, and those two words carried more weight than anything else he had said, because they meant time, they meant uncertainty, they meant something that could still change. And if they find out? I asked quietly, and this time he did not answer immediately. He looked at me for a second, like he was deciding how much truth to give. Then, you become leverage, he said finally, and there it was, the word that explained everything. Not fear, not revenge, not even danger, just leverage, something used to control, something used to influence, something that could be taken or threatened to force a result. I swallowed hard, my hands tightening slightly in my lap. Not because I was panicking, but because I was understanding. And Emma, I said softly, and his gaze sharpened instantly, like that name carried more weight than anything else in this conversation. She is the reason we do not let that happen, he said, and there was no hesitation in that, no distance, no calculation, just certainty. And for the first time since this started, I felt it clearly, not just control, not just obligation, but something else, something that felt personal. I exhaled slowly, my mind moving through everything he had said, everything that had already happened, everything that could still happen, and for the first time, I was not trying to reject it, I was trying to navigate it. What do you need from me? I asked, and this time there was no resistance in the question, no attempt to pull away, just focus. He watched me for a second, longer than usual, like he was confirming something, like he was making sure this was real. Consistency, he said. You do not change your routine, you do not draw attention to yourself, you do not react to things that feel out of place unless I tell you to. I nodded, because that made sense, because that was something I could do. And you, I added, what exactly are you doing? His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, like that question touched on something deeper. I am removing variables, he said simply, and I did not ask what that meant, not because I did not want to know, but because I understood enough to know I did not need the details. And the man today, I said, he was one of them. He was looking. Adrian replied, that is enough. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, as the weight of everything settled into something more solid, something I could hold on to instead of something I was trying to escape. This is not temporary, I said after a moment, and it was not a question this time, it was a statement, and he met my gaze without hesitation. No, he said, it is not. Silence settled between us for a few seconds, not uncomfortable, not tense, just quiet, like both of us were acknowledging the same reality from different sides. Then we need rules, I said finally, and his expression shifted slightly, like he expected that, like he welcomed it. We already have some, he replied. Then we make them clear, I said, my voice steady, now grounded in something that felt more like control than anything I had felt before. You protect us, but you do not control us. You inform me of anything that affects me or my daughter, and you do not keep things from me, because you think it is easier that way. He listened without interrupting, his attention fully on me, like every word mattered, like this was not just a conversation, but something being built. And you, he said when I finished. You listen when I tell you something is a risk, you do not ignore it because it feels inconvenient, and you trust that I am not guessing. I held his gaze for a second, longer than usual. Then nodded once, because that was fair, because that was the balance we had been circling around since the beginning. Agreed, I said quietly, and this time the word felt heavier, more permanent, like it meant something real, like it had consequences beyond this moment. He leaned back slightly, then his posture relaxing just enough to notice, and for the first time since I had met him, there was something close to ease in the way he carried himself, like the tension that had been constant since the tracks had shifted just slightly. I will take you home, he said, and I nodded, because that was no longer something I resisted, not after everything, not after today. The car moved smoothly through the city, the familiar streets passing by, but feeling different now, like they belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed in the same way. When we reached my building, he stepped out first, this time opening the door for me, not out of habit, not out of show, just deliberate, like everything he did. I stepped out, meeting his gaze one more time, before turning toward the entrance. "Lily," he said, and I paused, looking back at him. "This only works if you do not carry it alone," he added, and something about that stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. Not the warning, not the certainty, just that single idea that this was not something I had to hold by myself. I nodded once, then turned away, walking inside the building, the door closing behind me, with that same familiar sound, but this time, it did not feel like separation. It felt like transition, like stepping from one part of my life into another. And as I made my way up the stairs toward the place I had always called home, I realized something that settled quietly, but completely inside me. I was no longer trying to get my life back. I was learning how to live inside a new one. I used to think survival meant holding everything together by myself, keeping every piece of my life exactly where it belonged, making sure nothing slipped, nothing broke, nothing changed. But standing in my apartment that night, watching Emma sleep, and knowing that somewhere just outside Adrian was still there, I realized something I had been refusing to see. Survival did not always look like control. Sometimes it looked like trust, and I did not know if I was ready for that. Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, her small hand shifting across the blanket, her face peaceful in a way that made everything else feel louder, sharper, more fragile. I stood there for a long moment, just watching her, memorizing the quiet, because I knew now how quickly it could be disrupted, how easily something unseen could reach into a life and change it completely. I moved away from her bed, slowly closing the door behind me with care. The apartment felt different at night, quieter, but not empty, like there was something just beyond the walls, something waiting, something steady. I walked back to the window without thinking about it, my eyes drawn there like they had been all day, and he was still there, not in the exact same spot, but close enough. The car positioned differently, the angle changed, but the presence unchanged, constant, controlled. I leaned lightly against the frame, my arms crossed loosely as I watched him for a second, longer than I intended, and for the first time since all of this started, I did not feel the immediate urge to pull away, to close the curtains, to pretend he was not there. Instead, I just stood there, acknowledging it, accepting it, like part of my reality had shifted into something new, something I was learning how to stand inside. My phone buzzed softly in my hand, breaking the stillness. I glanced down, expecting nothing, expecting everything, and there it was, a message from him, simple, direct. "Lights off, soon, you need rest." I exhaled a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because the words were so unexpected, not controlling, not commanding, just aware. I typed back before I could think too much about it. "You have been out there all day." The reply came almost instantly. "I am where I need to be." I stared at the screen for a second, longer than necessary, because that answer said more than it should have, because it meant he was choosing this not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but because he had decided it mattered. I set the phone down, slowly, my thoughts quieter now, less chaotic than they had been earlier in the day, like something had settled into place, not resolution, not clarity, but acceptance of what this was becoming. I moved through the apartment, turning off lights, checking doors, small routines that grounded me in something familiar, something I still controlled. And when everything was quiet again, I stopped in the middle of the room, listening, not for danger, not for anything specific, just for the feeling of it, the shift that had happened, the space that had been created between who I was and who I was becoming. The next morning came softer than the last, the light warmer, the air calmer, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like things had slowed, like the world had given me space to breathe. I got ready the same way I always did, moving through each step with intention, with awareness, but without the resistance that had defined the days before. Emma joined me at the table, her energy brighter than the night before, her smile easy, natural, and I held on to that, because it reminded me why all of this mattered, why every decision, every compromise, every step forward had to be made carefully. "He is still here," she said again as we prepared to leave, and I nodded without hesitation, now without trying to soften it or change it. "Yes," I said, "and he will be for a while." She accepted that easily, the way children accept things that adults complicate with doubt and fear, and we stepped outside together, the morning air crisp and clear, the street already alive with movement, but I saw it immediately, the car, the position, the presence, and this time, it did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like something expected, something accounted for. We walked to school, and I did not look back. Every few seconds, I did not search for signs or patterns. I just walked, because I knew he was there, because I trusted that he was paying attention in a way I no longer had to. Emma hugged me goodbye at the gate, her smile bright, her steps quick as she disappeared into the building, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary watching until she was gone. Then I turned back toward the street, and he was there waiting like he always was, but something about it felt different this time, less like distance. Less like two separate worlds intersecting, and more like something shared, something understood. I walked toward him slowly, stopping in front of him, without hesitation, without the tension that had been there before. "You are getting used to this," he said quietly, and I met his gaze steadily. "I am learning," I replied, and the difference between those two things mattered more than either of us said. He nodded once like he understood exactly what I meant, like he respected the distinction, and for the first time since all of this started, there was no resistance between us, no push, no pull, just something balanced, something that existed without needing to be forced. "This does not mean I belong to your world," I added after a moment, and his expression shifted slightly, not disagreement, not correction, just acknowledgement. "No," he said, "it means your world and mine are no longer separate." I held that for a second, letting it settle, letting it become something real, instead of something I fought against. And as I stood there in the morning light with the city moving around us, and a life behind me that no longer looked the same as it did before, I realized something that felt both terrifying and steady. At the same time, I had not been pulled into his world, I had stepped into it, and now I was standing there not as someone who had been taken, not as someone who had been forced, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and that choice was going to change everything.